chance to take a breath. And I love the fact that today we're getting all kinds of perspectives on how, this work could and should and needs to be done, because I think that's really important. And what's especially exciting is when we all kind of come together and we're like, yes, that's important. And I especially felt that with Sophia, like hearing the back and forth between something that you try to improve in the way that you do your work, and that would have been meaningful for someone else for that to have been recognized. I think Sophia used the word validating, but like that's exactly what we want to do here. We want to be kind of validating what practices would be useful in what we work. So because I usually speak so fast and I get through everything quickly, last time I tried to slow down and we didn't get through everything. So we can circle back to any of those ideas or concepts that we need to, because I think we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end and for answers and for discussions, whether it's folks coming in from online or whether it's folks in this room. And then one of the other things that we talked about is that there's probably things that have come up for folks, questions throughout this. And if someone doesn't feel comfortable asking a question as we go, they can always submit that question to the staff. And when we put together a toolkit for other folks to use, we can make sure that we answer those questions, or that we get back to someone on a one-on-one basis if they have a specific question about a story that they want to work on, or that they're hoping to work on, or that they are working. We can give some kind of support or guidance or feedback if that's helpful. So we're going to delve a little bit more deeply into the interviewing portion of this. We kind of went over it a little bit more quickly. And so we're going to try to talk about some practical things when it comes to interviewing. But one thing that I wanted to mention to folks kind of at the beginning was that we can talk about this all we want. We could talk about this all day, 8-hour training on interviewing. Until we get practice, we don't really get to put these things into place in a way that they feel good to us and good to the folks who we're interviewing. One of the things that I think about in some of the reporting that I did years ago on the Steubenville rape case, a lot of the discussion afterwards, doing those stories, and also in Roll Red Roll, which is the film Nancy Schwartzman made about it. We had a lot of conversations about bystander training. And one of the realizations that, we came to and talking to a lot of folks is that, especially with young people, but really with all of us, you can be told something a lot of times, but unless you get a chance to put it into action, it's not really something that you do. And I also think about this like in a law enforcement setting, right? You always hear about training, if you ever cover police or criminal justice, they'll say, oh, well, you have to qualify on the shooting range all the time, right? You have to go out there and practice this thing that you may do. It's the same thing for driving, right? If you're going to drive a police cruiser, you have to know how to control it. And the only way you know how to do that is practicing it. And I think with some of these interview techniques, we can go through them and we can talk about it, but we don't actually get a lot of chances to practice them until we get into a situation where we're actually doing it. And that can be really uncomfortable. And so to the extent that we can, practicing this with other journalists, or if we have people in our lives who are kind enough to let us practice with them, that's helpful. And it may seem difficult, but like sitting down with someone and saying, okay, let's go through the motions of what we would do if we were doing an interview. It's actually really helpful as a reporter to kind of settle that, because you might think in your mind what language you're going to use, and then you get in that situation and we all get a little bit more, a little more crackly, a little bit more nerves, and then we fumble, and then we feel like, oh, I'm failing at this. But when you can actually play it through and think about that, how it worked, how it didn't work, it can be really, really helpful. The same way that now when you talk about bystander intervention training with teenagers, they don't say, here's what you should do at a party if you see something, and then just expect them to do it. They actually go through and train on those scenarios. So the more that you can make time to do that, even if it seems weird or if you're busy, the more helpful that will be. So here's some of the things we can talk about in terms of interviewing about considering. A setting can be really important. You know, we don't always get to choose where we might talk to someone. As a reporter, that might be outside a courtroom, which probably isn't the setting anybody would choose. Mm-hmm. But when we have the option to pick something, we can have a conversation with someone. For some folks, their home might be a very comfortable place. For other people, that might be the place that they least want to talk to because either they've had some, you know, trauma there, or other folks in the house might be intruding on a interview. An advocate or a counselor's office, like I have had folks, including Sandy, who's in this picture, where when we initially met, we met in the office of her therapist because it was a very comfortable place. Mm-hmm. It was a place that she was used to sharing pieces of her story, so that was normal for her. And with other folks, really sitting still in a place was difficult. So sometimes I would suggest maybe we take a walk, right? And just get to know each other in a setting that doesn't feel like a formal interview. Now, what I could add to a slide like this is sometimes someone might say over Zoom would work. I would say that most journalists would be like, no, I don't want that. But it's really about meeting folks in the most easy place for them. And also who should be there. We talked earlier about asking someone if they want a support person to be there for them, whether that be an advocate they've been working with, a family member that they're comfortable talking around. You may laugh that I put pet there, but I've had folks that have asked me over the years, like, I would feel so much better if like we could be with my dog could sit on my lap, and just things that are very relaxing for them. So I'm always open to all options and suggestions for things like that. One of the things that I think about, okay, missing a slide. Oh, wow. I'm missing a super important slide, but that's okay. I'll bring it back in. So talk about setting goals and boundaries for an interview. One of the things to think about is, will this be the only interview that you have with someone? Mm-hmm. And if so, sharing what do you need to accomplish in that interview, or will there be multiple opportunities to speak? That's something for you to think about in advance. Talking to a survivor in advance about whether there are details that they do not want to discuss, and also talking a little bit about issues of identification. I never ask someone to make a decision on how they feel about being identified at the very beginning of a process. But what I do tell them is that there's a range of ways that they might be able to be identified. And once we get through the process of doing interviews and talking about a story, then we can talk about what feels right to them. Having a plan for if a survivor becomes activated. I put activated in quotes. I don't generally like to use quotes like that, but there's a lot of ways that people might describe their trauma reactions. But for me, activated means that, and this is a term that a survivor used that I thought really made sense, means that they start to either feel some distress or effects of the trauma all the way to the point where they're like, okay, I'm dissociating here. I'm not really here in this interview with you because of the details that I'm sharing. So we might not recognize that right away, right? Because we don't know someone, we don't know what their body reactions might be, what their facial reactions might be. But having a discussion with them or a plan ahead of time to say, is there a way you can cue me, if you start to feel this way, so I can stop, because I might not recognize it. So one conversation that I had with a survivor, and I've done this with a couple other folks, was I would just tell them, you could just hold your hand up. You need a break, just hold it up like this. Because usually, even if you're starting to feel trauma reactions in your body, you can do that, and you don't have to stop and say, I need to stop, or this isn't working for me. You don't even have to verbalize it. You can just kind of hold your hands up, and I'll know you either need to pause, take a break, or you need to stop this interview, and then I don't have to try to be figuring it out. And then also discussing in advance how each of you can follow up, because what I've often found is after talking to a survivor, we will have a conversation, and then they'll leave, and then a lot of other things will flood into their brains that they wanted to say, or which they would have said, or questions that I wish would have asked. So I always make it clear, like, what's the opportunity and how do we follow up? All right, so starting with an open narrative. Has anyone heard of this term, open narrative? Do you know what it means? So this is a concept that I actually did pick up from some training years and years ago, someone that was doing some training for investigators. And what they found was that law enforcement or people who are trained as detectives to be investigators would come into an interview, and they would have this set of questions that they knew they needed to ask that would then result in their police report that had all the information that it needed on it. So this was the narrative that they were trying to build, to say, I need these things to build a case, right? But an open narrative is different. It starts, like it sounds, open, but you can sit down with someone and encourage them to tell what happened, and you don't have to be specific about that. You don't have to give a starting point, but you want to have as few interruptions as possible. And there's a couple of reasons that I think this is really powerful. And some people might not like this part, but when I sit down with someone and I talk about this open narrative, I generally don't take notes. If they're comfortable, I'll ask them if I can record the conversation, and I'll tell them why. I'll say, I don't want to take notes while we're talking because that's going to be a distraction for me. I'll be paying attention to what I'm writing down. If you're okay with it, I'd like to record this so I can listen to it later. That way I can pay attention to what you're saying fully and not be distracted by something else. And that's usually something that folks understand. And I will tell them, I'm going to use this recording for me versus this is something like I'm going to use this recording to publish, because those are two different purposes, right? If you do want to make a recording to publish, I think that's a separate conversation. But using an open narrative and encouraging someone to tell what happened, which is how I usually start it, can be really helpful. And I'm going to give one example why. And this isn't a story that's centered on sexual assault, but there was a mother who I was interviewing. And the reason that she had contacted me was that she and her children were living in a home where there was lead poisoning. And she had called many times about this and tried to get folks involved in fixing the problem because her children had elevated levels of lead in their blood, and she was very upset by this. And eventually they ended up with nowhere to go. They ended up homeless. They were living in a shelter. So I met with her, and it wasn't the best of situations. Some of her kids were there. We were in a restaurant. It was not a situation I would set up, but for her, she really urgently wanted to talk, and I wanted to meet her in the best place. And I started with, I have plenty of questions, but I just want you to tell me what happened. And she started with her at 12 years old, when her father was shot and killed in a park in Cleveland, and how the police never solved it, and they never answered questions, and they never. So for her narrative started way before I thought it would have started. And it also clued me into the fact that the reason that she was so upset, wasn't only singularly about lead poisoning, but it was all of these things that we talked about earlier, this context that you need to bring in about what people have gone through before and what influences how they feel. So in that moment, I felt like where she was starting her story told me that this wasn't the first time she felt that a system or that authorities had failed her, and that was going to play into how she felt about that situation then. And I think letting people start where they want to start is important for that reason. And then she continued on from there, kind of through a lot of other things that she had gone through in her life that were very difficult, where she didn't get the help and support she needed to get through them. And so it was a lot longer of an interview. Very little of it was actually about the mechanics of what happened in her home. But it was very instructive in terms of a narrative, and also helped me reflect on the fact that people who are going through something like their children being lead poisoned often are carrying so many other things with them. And that may play into the reasons that they react the way they react when systems fail them. So also thinking about follow-ups, one of the things that I try to do is not interrupt someone when they're telling that story, even if I have something that I would like to know or that doesn't quite make sense. Sometimes I'll make myself a little note. Sometimes I'll listen back later, but often I'll keep those questions in my head. And I try to think about a neutral way to ask clarifying questions. If that's hard to do, one of the easiest things you can do is just train your brain to not start any of the questions with the word why, which I think we've heard about a lot today, about how the big why questions really impact folks, because it's different. You're not asking for like a fact, really. You're asking for a reason. And we know that doesn't always exist, or it doesn't always exist in the way someone can control it. So some of the things that I'll use, or I'll say, can you share a little more about, and then whatever part of their story that I didn't quite understand, or that I need to know more about, or I'll say something like, so when that happened, what did that mean to you? You know, so I can understand for them and their experience what something meant. I really, really, really try to avoid how did that feel. And I feel like in all of the cheesiest and worst journalism, movies, and actual journalism, you see this very, you know, compelling moment where someone's describing something, and then you see the journalist lean in and go, don't do that. Because that's really like, I'm trying to think like, what answer are you trying to get? No one is going to be like, actually it was awesome. You know? So asking questions like that are kind of performative, I think aren't really helpful to people. And they kind of will usually be like, well, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean? How did it feel? You're kind of setting someone up for like the answer that you want and not really exploring more of their experience. Here, okay. Gathering string. So that is a very journalism term, right? I know we're talking about people's lives here, but we often talk about gathering string for a story. And I think it could be viewed in a kind of negative way, but I view it in a way that like when we're putting a story together, there's a lot of weaving that happens. And journalists tend to want the weaving to happen their way, right? You know, we want to talk to someone, we want to sit down, we want to have this interview. We want to get the information and we want to go back and write the story. But I found that opening up as many possible ways for this input can be really helpful, because I think we're better now at knowing that everybody communicates differently. But I learned this lesson really well in the story with Johanna, and it wasn't because I was so intuitive and brilliant that I thought of different ways that people could communicate with me. But if you can see in this picture, Johanna's in the hospital. And if you see there's something purple sitting on her lap, that is actually a whiteboard. Because when we first started reporting on the story, photographer Gus Van and I, Johanna could not speak. She was shot in the face, part of her jaw was shot off. She had surgery to create a new jaw for her, and she literally could speak no words. And so I'm sitting, you know, in her hospital room, and the discussions we were having about how to go about the story that we've talked about today, we were having by me talking and her responding by writing on a whiteboard. So we had an entire conversation about like what my job is by her writing questions and me answering them. We really figured out ways to continue on that path. First, it was a practical reason, but then it was because I realized even though I was slightly older than her, it was so much easier for her to communicate about some of the most difficult stuff when we actually weren't sitting in front of each other. And so, at least at first, and so for journalists, like we want what we want, right? I want you here so I can see your reactions and observe you. And, you know, it's all about what we need, what we want. But for other folks, like naturally, there's different ways to communicate that are easier. So in this particular case, we did a lot of reporting via text message. Much to the chagrin of my editors, because texting plans were new and there was thousands of them and they cost us a lot of money. But, sometimes I would be thinking about something and I would pose a very simple question to Johanna, and then I wouldn't hear back for a little bit. And then at maybe midnight, I would get 17 texts with like, oh, I've really been thinking about that. And this is what came up for me. And that was all very useful information, and it was on her terms. The other thing that we did was she had told me that she kept a journal throughout, you know, her entire relationship. And she was very comfortable journaling. So I actually bought a journal, and we had a thing of where I would write a question in the journal and I would give it to her, and then she would take her time with it and then tell me, okay, I'm done. And I would go get the journal and bring it back, and I would read what she wrote. And that was the way for her to communicate. Occasionally I'd write a question in the journal, and I would get it back and there would be a poem there. And I was like, what do I do with this poem? Trying to understand it. But I like kind of that idea of letting folks decide what the best way is for them to communicate. In the Sandy story that we talked about earlier, she liked to do notes mode and voice memos. So maybe we had been talking about something and she would be driving around and she would just record, you know, using her voice memo something that had been on her mind that she thought I should know about. And then I would just get this like message that would pop up, and I'd listen to it, and it would be like, oh, remember we talked about this? I was thinking about it the other day, and then this is what I recognized, or this is what I realized. And so is that the easiest way to report a story? No, if everybody did things your way and just sat down in one interview and told you everything you knew, that would probably be the easiest. But this is probably better, because you're really checking in with each person about what works for them. And I have found that you actually get better information, more detailed information than if someone is sitting in front of you and very nervous and is kind of giving you the answer that they think you might want in the moment. So open up those ways of doing things. Also, you have to be then very meticulous about saving everything in a safe place. And remember the puzzle pieces we were talking about earlier. One of the things that I love to do with folks is tell them about the puzzle pieces at the beginning, or I'll tell them, a detective that I had worked with a little bit, following some of the cases that she was on involving sexual assault kits. She would describe them as Postit notes rather than puzzle pieces, probably from a training that she would have. And she would say, I understand that some of the memories you have may be like Postit notes. They might be all different places and involve different information. And part of my job as a detective is to help get those Postit notes and put them in a kind of order that we can recognize them. That's how I build a case. I take all your Postit notes and I put them in the right order. So often I'll tell folks about this so that they can see that this is something that we're working on together. I don't want it just to be my job. I like it when it's partially their job as well, because it's this investment of us working on something together. And so I try to make it clear to someone in a moment that if their memory is not there, or if something's fuzzy, or they only have a piece of it, that it's okay to make that clear. Because I would often find people are reaching to give you a concrete answer when one doesn't exist. And I'll also tell them, like, we can include that in a story. Like, if something is not clear to you, you can just say that. And that is okay. That is us, you being transparent with me being transparent with a reader, so they understand this. Because how else will readers understand that memories can be fuzzy and unclear when someone's gone through a trauma, unless we share that with them? And the more we do that, the more this idea that people get in the community that they have about how narratives work will shift over time. The other thing I wanted to say is that reconstructing a narrative can be really, really, really hard. It's not kind of work that you just jump into with someone, but I do also think it can be restorative and it can be healing when it's done right. And I've heard that again and again from survivors, that the process of putting their narrative together can be supportive for them. And something that Sophia said really kind of struck me from what I've heard from a lot of survivors is that, healing is not a straight line. It's more of a jagged line, and you don't always get to this particular point at the end. But if you do put together your own narrative, you can continue to put it together. So if you're able to work with someone in this practice of putting together your narrative, even if you write a story and you publish it and it's done, someone can actually continue that process. They can keep writing their own story for themselves, because there's like these tools in place now to do that. And I know a lot of folks that have done that and continue to either write on their own or tell their stories on their own, because they now know that it's possible to do. We skipped over the language part because I was talking too long and running out of time, but I wanted to come back to it. I know what I call the other Rachel, just we're commonly referring to each other as the other Rachel. We might actually get some t-shirts that say the other Rachel. Is kind of one of the things that journalists have really struggled with, and it also had to reckon with when we adapt law enforcement language in our stories. So can anyone think about the example of this that everybody might have on their minds after the past couple of years when we talk about law enforcement and journalism? So often we are taking stuff from police reports. Do you have an idea?
I'm just thinking the police involved shooting.
Yes, you are absolutely right. So
peaceful protester.
Yeah, so one of the things that we think about is I always, when I'm talking about folks, I'm try to replace your own, how you would describe something And when I was coming up in a newsroom, it was perfectly acceptable, or people would change things to officer involved shooting. But then when you start replacing terms like that with other regular terms, it doesn't make any sense. It's not an allowance that we make for any other profession, really.
Yeah.
We don't have like a doctor involved surgery, right? They just perform, doctors do a surgery, right? So I think really thinking about those things, and while we have to use materials, we have to it's our job to put those materials in context. So we can start to think about things from terms of victim or survivor. When I started in journalism, there was no choice. Now we can go to folks who we're working with and saying, hey, here's some choices. Like, what are you more comfortable with us calling you? I have folks that said, I really don't want you to call me a survivor because I'm not there yet. I'm still struggling. And so I think everybody has their own reasons. You just kind of either explain them, or you accept them and you use those in a story. Thinking about how we describe assaults and injuries is very important in terms of the terminology that we use. One of the worst moments of my professional life was when I was in Steubenville covering the trials around that rape case. And I had an editor that absolutely would not discuss with me the language that we were going to use. And, in that case, the rape was a digital penetration. And I was trying to explain that, we have to tell people what happened because they won't understand. And in fact, the children involved in this rape case did not understand that a digital penetration was rape. They, of course, knew it was wrong, but they didn't understand legally that's what it was. And then it was for us to be the grown-ups that actually described what these things were, but do it in a responsible way. And I had a grown man who was like, I'm not talking about this with you, So we have to have those conversations in advance, and we have to do our best to really explain things in a way that people understand them. I know that Rachel this morning was talking about the Ohio Revised Code and whatever. As a journalist, there's going to be a huge push and pull for basically how do we make things as accurate as possible, but also for people to understand them. And that's why our job is really, really hard. Because if we were to use all the Ohio Revised Code terminology, nobody would know what we're talking about. And then if we oversimplify it, we're not accurate. So what are we to do? In that situation, I default to the very basic, how would you describe it to your mom or your sister or your brother very accurately? Because I think that forces you to think about something in a different way than if you were writing it for a story. And it often takes a lot of iterations. One thing that I get agitated over in newsrooms is the use of the word alleged. Some people have policies. Sometimes you'll go into a newsroom and someone will say, this is the way we're doing things. And you feel like, well, what power do I have to change that? And what I've often said to folks is that I have never stumbled across a story about an alleged bike theft, because no one ever comes in and says, I'm not really sure this bike was stolen, but you're just gonna. And so earlier, Rachel said that yes, this blaming or this not believing happens for a lot of crimes, but you really see things play out in language where we go to many, many lengths to put lots of words in front of sexual assaults. I have over time come to be really more comfortable with reported, because claimed telegraphs disbelief, alleged telegraphs disbelief. And reported, I would say, doesn't telegraph all belief, but it's accurate. If someone reported that something happened, now you may have a crime that happened a while ago and it wasn't reported, you're just going to have to explain that. But for me, when covering, sexual assault or sexual violence, in real time, that's what I try to use, because I feel like it's the best place that we've been able to get to. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask if covering something that wasn't reported, but you don't want to use alleged. I've seen it recommended to say so and so said that this happened.
Yeah, said is very neutral. Yeah, said is a very neutral word. And I also think describing what happened. So and so told this person, or so and so said this happened. They didn't tell, but so I often find that folks that are not law enforcement aren't considered as actual reported, but they really are. You know, people
Yeah.
are telling folks when things happen, but if you're not, well, if you go home and you tell your roommate something happened, you are still reporting something to someone.
Yeah.
But maybe you would just use, told or something like that. It's going to be more neutral. You wouldn't say that you allegedly told their
Yeah.
that would be really awkward.
Yeah.
And so I always like to share a couple of these law enforcement narratives so we can really see. And I think that Rachel shared a couple like these. But when we see these things, I have literally seen lines from these reports picked up and put in stories, and it's very painful. So this is about a report that involved a 13-year-old by two males, 15 and 19. She was walking home from middle school. Let me emphasize middle school. The report stated the victim is a habitual runaway and has run away 3 times prior. As if you couldn't just put up a sign that said, this was probably her fault, right? Folks, we all agree. And so I think when we see things like this in reports, we can't fix them, but we cannot adopt that language or include some of those details in our story. But earlier we were talking about that, right? What details we include and what details we don't. I do think it's important to use things as context. And so this is that I feel like I keep bringing up these aha moments for me. So we talked a little bit earlier about the Anthony Sowell case and some of the survivors that were in that case, some of the victims that did not survive. And I remember thinking about that because it was very complicated to navigate, the fact that we had 11 Black women that were killed. How do we talk about this? How do we not include details like the fact that some of them had prior reports of mental health or instability or drug addiction? Because on one hand, you're like, okay, this is information. And on the other hand, you're like, I don't want people to view this as a reason that someone deserved to be harmed, because I don't want to mean it that way. And it kind of clarified for me in an instance we were talking about it publicly and nationally, by turning it around and thinking about like law enforcement and how they were perceiving this, right? What was their job in terms of this? And I would hear from a lot of folks in law enforcement who would say, well, what am I supposed to do? This person's got like a drug addiction, I can't track it down. Oh, well, if this person had like a bunch of reports that they had been hospitalized for mental health, they're just not a good witness. They're not a good victim was the term that was used a lot. And what really kind of came up for me was that all of these things that people were saying actually made what Anthony Sowell did very easy. He used all of those things to find the exact folks that nobody would believe. So this is a case in which I feel like, serial rapists, sometimes serial rapists and murders, they outsmart everybody by leveraging those things. They're like, I know that you will not pay attention to this person because of their history. They gather those facts as they prey on folks, right? And they use them. And so I think we can actually put them in those contexts. We can talk about how having a substance use disorder can make someone more vulnerable to folks because they know that they are less likely to be believed. We can talk about how someone who has struggled with mental health or, paranoia or, hallucinations, like that would be the exact person who a predator would be following around. You can actually use that as context in stories too. And you can do it in ways like I am, but you can also do it in bigger ways. One of the things when we were looking at all of the untested rape kits and the stories that the reports that weren't followed up on in the 90s and the 2000s, we put a bunch of them on a map, and there was just this like big swirl around this area in downtown. And I'm like, oh, like, what is this? Like, what is this area? Let's drill down in it. And it was the women's homeless shelter. And it was like, well, yeah. So all these like perpetrators were like making a beeline for the perimeter of the women's homeless shelter because they were like, I know who nobody's going to care about and who nobody's going to believe in. So I think that's why we have to really carefully navigate how we use descriptors, but also not completely scrap them in terms of context. We just have to do it the right way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're actually not giving everybody the full picture of what is happening and why. And we're preventing folks from being able to have like clear ideas of like what parts of this need to be solved for, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could really make the folks who are in that homeless shelter a hell of a lot safer if you know that it's happening, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at it as a whole picture rather than just one report and then another report and another report. Quickly, just talking about ways to work together. One thing that I like to do as a practice is to make a timeline, because I feel like when you're asking someone to share really personal details about their story, and I'm talking about like the kind of visceral details, that's hard. But when you get to a timeline, it's something you can construct together. So some folks I've worked with, that needs to be on paper. Some folks who are more comfortable online, I've done like a shared Google Doc, which is like the weirdest way to like report something. You're actually sharing a Google Doc with someone and contributing to it, but it's very much a now thing that we can do. And looking at it as a timeline gives you something concrete. And on that timeline, you can actually put, it can start wherever they want it to start, you know, when they're born or when they reported an assault, whatever works for them. And on that timeline, you can include information that you both know is true and why, and then things you're not sure of and you're still trying to figure out. I've done that with some folks, and the great thing is it helps clarify for them what they're solid on and what they're not. And also sometimes I will attach, you know, links or documents, and it's like, here's how we know this. Or I'll have them look at something and say, all right, here's the police report that we got this information from. Is there anything in this police report that's actually not true from your memory? And then we can add that in there too as context on the timeline. And sometimes we'll review documents together. We'll talk about, well, these are just some of the general things we talked about before, talking about trauma symptoms as they come up. And then also making space for what a survivor thinks is important. We often decide what we think is important in a story. One of the things that was interesting to me in Sandy's story is that we had really done most of the reporting, and her perpetrator actually was charged and was going to be sentenced, and the hearing was not what she had hoped it would be. She was actually cut off by the judge and wasn't allowed to finish. And for her, you know, that was a really big deal. That was, here I waited all this time for this moment and I was cut off, and it actually felt very badly. And as a reporter and editor, we had this very significant back and forth on whether to include this in the story, because it was a very long story already, included a lot of things, and was this the most important thing? And really where we ended the discussion was like, this was really important for her to put in the story, that, you know, even after all of this, there was still this instinct to kind of shut down how she felt about it. So we included it. One of the last things, and I don't know if this is going to play or not, but we've gone back and forth. Oops. All right, let me just set this up really quick. We talked a lot about choice making, like when something is worth doing or not worth doing, when it's going to cause more harm or not cause more harm. And that's always something you have to decide together. And I would say that one of the most difficult instances of that I've ever dealt with was with Sandy. And we were able to get the video of her very first interview with police. Wow. And we told her we had it, we were going to watch it, and it was going to be up to her if she wanted to see it. And she decided she did want to see it. And we're like, oh, how should that happen? Do you want to see it alone? Do you want to watch it with the therapist? And we decided that we would bring it to the therapist's office, and then we kind of go from there. We talk it through, and she wanted to see it. We were there in the room with her when she saw it. And it was probably one of the most difficult moments in my journalistic life ever. I went and sat in my car and sobbed afterwards. It was so hard.
Yeah.
And I just thought, oh my gosh, we just did the wrong thing. We just did the wrong thing with her watching this video. And then later that night, I got a series of text messages where she was like, you know, that was really hard. It took me a while to settle down from it. She goes, but I'm so glad we watched that, because I was right. Everything I thought I told them, and now I had proof. Because before then, she'd been questioning herself. Did I tell the detectives? Did I tell the detectives that? She didn't have any memory of the interview at all. So as hard as it was, she found it as worthwhile. And had we operated differently and been like, we're not going to show this to you, or we're not going to watch this with you, you know, that wouldn't have been the outcome. So I just wanted to show you just a little bit of it so you could see, because I think you have to kind of know how difficult that's going to be, but also why it's important, why it might be important for someone to see. This is like a longer clip. I'll leave it in the presentation so people can see it. But one of the things that this was a clip that when we were selecting 2 clips from this to share, like we went through the whole thing with Sandy, and these were 2 that she was comfortable with people seeing. Others had like details where we're like, let's not put this out there to be publicly. But one of the reasons that she was okay with this being shared was that she really wanted folks to see how sure she was and how detailed she was, and how even in this moment, you know, she's saying like, this is what was happening to me. So then later, when the detective didn't make one follow-up phone call and didn't do any work on her case, she was like, I don't understand, like, what did I do wrong? Did I not share the right way? Did I not give the right information? It was important for her, and this is another example of having a discussion, for people to be able to see very clearly that she gave this information and that this information was believable and accurate, and that she was still being affected by it in that moment. And so that was like one of 2 clips that we shared. One of the other clips that I didn't put in this presentation was where the detective actually promised her, we're going to get him, we're going to get this person, before not doing that work. And for me, I also carry that as a reminder of like us making promises. Because I saw kind of really close up the harm that false promise made, and that no litany of excuses later about how many cases the detective had or how many things were happening meant anything. And so that's why I'm always like, I'm the first person to want to promise everything to someone, and I have to really exercise control not to make promises like that, because those promises are really. So that is all about interviewing.